The chef came out of his kitchen at 8 minutes past, still in his whites, and in front of a dining room of 90 people. He lowered himself onto one knee beside a small table pushed against the wall by the swinging kitchen door, and he took an old woman's hand, and he could not speak. For a long second, the room did not understand what it was seeing. The fork stopped, the pianist near the bar let a phrase trail off and forgot to begin the next one. A man 2 tables over set down his wine without finishing the sip. The most celebrated chef in the city, a man whose face was printed on the cover of 3 magazines that year, was kneeling on his own marble floor with his head bowed, holding the hand of a 71-year-old woman in a plain navy dress who had been seated 40 minutes earlier at the worst table in the house. She did not pull her hand away. She did not look around at the staring faces. Her back stayed straight against the hard chair, and the only thing that moved was her thumb, once, brushing the back of the kneeling man's knuckles the way you steady a child who has finally stopped running. Here is what you need to understand before we go any further. Nothing about that table was an accident. The woman had been put beside the kitchen door on purpose by a man in a charcoal suit who had decided in 3 seconds that she did not belong in the front of his room. The chef on his knee had spent 20 years being told he was a genius, and he had come to believe it. And the reason he could not stand back up, the reason his shoulders were shaking, was that he had just learned where his genius came from, and he had learned it in front of everyone. That is the gap. His whole story lives inside. Hold it. We are going to come back to it. Let me take you back. Her name was Eunice Garrett, and on the evening this story turns on, she was 71 years old, and she had not wanted to come out at all. Her granddaughter had insisted. The family had a reason to celebrate, and the reason mattered. And so Eunice had pressed her navy dress the night before with an iron she had owned for 30 years, and she had pinned her grandmother's small gold brooch at the collar, and she had let her daughter help her into the car. Eunice was a small woman, narrow through the shoulders, with deep mahogany skin gone soft and finely lined at the eyes. Her hair was a short crown of tight silver coils she had stopped colouring a decade earlier. She walked with a slight care in her left hip, and she carried, that night and every night for 50 years, a particular thing in her handbag. It was a recipe ledger she had bound herself out of brown butcher paper and wax thread, swollen now to twice its first thickness, the cover spotted with old grease, and a brown ring where a coffee cup had once stood. Tucked into the binding, flat and dry as paper itself, was a single bay leaf she had pressed there the year she turned 25. She never explained the bay leaf to anyone. It was hers. That ledger has work to do before we are done. Keep it in mind. The restaurant was called St. Cloud, and it sat on the ground floor of a glass tower downtown, behind tall windows that held the amber glow of the city like water in a bowl. Inside, the walls were the colour of cold slate, hung with brushed brass sconces that threw small pools of gold. The tables wore white cloth, every glass was crystal. A reservation there was, booked 2 months out, and the family had booked theirs 3 months before, on the night Eunice's granddaughter got the news that started all of it. The granddaughter was named Carmen, and she was 34, an emergency room nurse who had just been named the head of her unit. She had grown up in Eunice's kitchen. She had earned the celebration. She had wanted, more than anything, to give her grandmother one night in a beautiful room, one night of being served instead of serving, because Eunice Garrett had spent her whole life feeding other people, and Carmen had never once seen anyone feed her. They arrived at 7. Carmen, her husband Daniel, their 8-year-old son Isaiah in a clip-on tie he kept tugging, and Eunice in her pressed navy dress with the ledger in her handbag. They gave the name at a brass podium near the door. And that is where they met the man in the charcoal suit. His name was Gregory Halloran, and he was the maître d'œuvre of St. Cloud, a tall man of about 45, with a smooth, pale face and a lanyard tucked into his breast pocket. He looked up from his reservation screen, and his eyes moved across the family, where a hand moves across a shelf looking for dust. He took in the boy's clip-on tie. He took in Daniel's jacket, which was a good jacket, 3 years old. He took in Eunice's navy dress and the small gold brooch and the handbag held in both hands and something behind his eyes closed like a till drawer. He smiled. The smile did not reach the rest of his face. He said the reservation was right here, of course, and he was so glad they could join St. Cloud this evening, and if they would just follow him. Then he led them past the good tables, past the table in the window with the amber city glow, past the table beneath the largest brass sconce. He led them the full length of the room to a single small table set against the back wall, hard beside the swinging door to the kitchen, where the waiters came through at a half-run and the white noise of the line never stopped, and he pulled out the chairs and said he hoped this would be comfortable in the tone of a man who hoped nothing of the kind. Carmen opened her mouth. Eunice touched her arm. It was a small touch, 2 fingers on her granddaughter's wrist, and it said everything. It said, "Sit down." It said, "Not tonight. Not over this. Not in front of the boy." Carmen sat down. The kitchen door swung open beside them with a gust of heat and clatter, and swung shut, and opened again. Eunice set her handbag on her lap. She folded her hands on top of it, and if you had been at the next table, you would not have looked twice. You would have seen a quiet old woman at a bad table, and you would have gone back to your wine, and you would have missed the whole thing. Let me tell you what you would have missed. Eunice Garrett had spent 38 years teaching people to cook. Not in a place with brass sconces. She had run the kitchen of a vocational training program on the east side of the city, a plain cinder block building with long steel tables and donated ovens that ran hot on the left side, where the students were people the rest of the world had already written off. Men coming home from prison who needed a trade, single mothers who needed a wage, kids who had aged out of foster care with nothing and nobody. The program took them in, and Eunice taught them to feed people, because she believed, the way her own grandmother had believed, that a person who can cook will never be entirely without power. You can be broke and feed someone. You can be grieving and feed someone. The skill is yours. Nobody can take it back. She taught knife work until their cuts were even. She taught them to taste, really taste, to close their eyes and find the one wrong note in a sauce. She taught them the long, patient, unglamorous foundations, the stocks that take a day, the mother sauces the whole craft stands on. And she taught one thing that was entirely her own, a method she had worked out over years at her own stove, a way of building a velouté that most cooks never learn because it cannot be rushed and it cannot be faked. Her students called it Mama Garrett's way. She just called it doing it right. She kept it all in the ledger, every correction, every ratio, every failure she had learned from. The bay leaf pressed in the binding was from the first batch of stock she ever made that came out exactly the way she wanted it when she was 25 and certain of nothing, and she had kept it for 50 years to remind herself that getting it right once is only the beginning. Here is the part the room at St. Cloud did not know. 22 years before that evening, a thin, furious, gifted 19-year-old had walked into that cinder block kitchen with a court paper in his pocket and nowhere else to be. He had no money. He had a temper that had already cost him 2 jobs, and he had hands, when he finally got them to be still, that could do anything Eunice showed them after seeing it only once. His name was Pascal Devereaux. Keep that name. We are coming back to it. Eunice saw what he was inside a week. She had seen talent before, and she had learned not to make a fuss over it, because talent without discipline is just a faster way to fail. So she did not flatter him. She corrected him. The first month, he hated her for it. He would build a sauce fast and flashy to show the room he was the best cook in it, and she would taste it on the tip of a clean spoon and set the spoon down and scrape the whole pan into the bin without a word and tell him to start again. He broke a whisk against the steel table once. The first week, and she did not raise her voice, she handed him a new whisk and pointed at the burner and waited arms folded until he picked it up. She made him build the velouté her way 40 times until he stopped fighting it and started understanding it. He asked her once, near the end of that first hard month, why she bothered. He had a record. He had a temper. The others in the program were quieter, easier, more grateful. He wanted to know why she spent her late hours on the angriest student in the room. Eunice wiped down her station and thought about it, the way she thought about everything, slowly, and then she told him that anger was just talent that had not been given anywhere to go, and that she had no use for grateful hands that could not cook, and every use in the world for furious ones that could. He never forgot that. He told himself for years that he had forgotten it. She stayed late with him when the others had gone home, the two of them and the donated ovens ticking as they cooled, the long steel tables white down and gleaming under the one bank of fluorescent lights that worked. She taught him the stock that takes a day. She taught him to clarify a butter until it was gold and silent. She taught him to close his eyes over a pot and find the one wrong note the way a piano tuner finds a flat string. She taught Pascal Devereaux everything she had spent a lifetime learning, and she asked nothing for it except that he do it right, and that he leave the kitchen cleaner than he found it, and that he never once cook for praise because praise was a thing other people gave you, and the work was a thing you gave yourself. He left after 2 years. He got a line job, then a better one, then a kitchen of his own. He was good. The world is quick to find a gifted young man and slow to ask who taught him. The magazines came, the investors came, the glass tower came, and the brass sconces, and the white cloth, and the 2-month wait. By the night, Eunice sat at the bad table by his kitchen door. Pascal Devereaux had not spoken her name in 15 years, and the signature dish that had made him famous, the one printed on the cover of those 3 magazines, the one the critics called impossible to copy, To Hublig Ad, was built on a velouté he had learned at a steel table in a cinder-block room from a woman he had let himself forget. She had not come to remind him. Understand that. She did not know it was his restaurant when Carmen booked it. The name on the door was the restaurant's name, not the man's, and Eunice had stopped following where her students landed years before because there had been hundreds of them and she loved them all the same, and you cannot hold 100 lives in your hands at once. She had come because her granddaughter wanted to buy her. One beautiful night. That is the whole of why she was there. The menus came. They were heavy and cream-coloured and had no prices on the one the waiter handed. Eunice, which was its own small message. Isaiah read his menu in a whisper and asked his mother what a velouté was, and Eunice, without looking up, told her great-grandson it was a sauce you make by being patient with something until it forgives you. The boy thought about that. Then he ordered the chicken. The food began to arrive, and it was beautiful, and most of it was very good. Eunice ate slowly and said little. She watched the kitchen door swing, and she watched the plates go by, and a part of her that had run a kitchen for 38 years was reading the whole room without trying to, the timing of the line, the temperature of the plates, the small panic on a young server's face that meant something had gone wrong on a table near the window. She could hear the kitchen, too, through the swinging door at her elbow, and a kitchen tells you everything if you have spent your life inside one. She heard a burner roaring too hard on the left side of the line and never quite turned down. She heard a sous chef call a time that came back 2 beats late, which meant a station was behind and pretending not to be. She heard the particular scrape of a pan being worked too fast. None of it was visible from the dining room. None of it would have reached a single other guest at any table in that gleaming room. To Eunice Garrett it was as loud and as legible as a page of her own handwriting, and she sat with her hands folded on her handbag and read it without meaning to, the way you cannot help reading a sign in your own language. Carmen watched her grandmother's face soften and sharpen by turns and thought it was the meal. It was not the meal. It was the music of a working kitchen, the thing Eunice had loved longest in this world, reaching her at a bad table where no one had thought she would understand a note of it. Then the signature dish came to the table next to theirs, and Eunice smelled it before she saw it. She went still. Something in the sauce was wrong. She did not announce it. She did not say a word. Her chin lifted half an inch, her eyes half closed, and she breathed it in again, the way you would lean toward a voice you almost recognized in a crowd. The velouté on that plate was hers. The method was hers, unmistakable. The long, patient building she had worked out at her own stove and pressed a bay leaf to celebrate 50 years before. She would have known it in the dark. She had taught it to 40 students who failed at it and one who did not, and it was broken. Somewhere in the line that night, someone had let the sauce break. Not curdled, not obviously ruined, nothing a hurried diner would catch. The emulsion had split at the edge, though, and been stirred back together in a hurry, and the texture had gone faintly grainy on the tongue, and the long, clean finish the method was built to produce had a sourness at the back of it that should not have been there. It was the single most famous sauce in the city, and it was going out broken, and 90 people were eating it and calling it genius, because no one in that room had ever been taught to taste the difference. Eunice set down her fork. She did not say it to embarrass anyone. She said it quietly to her own table, the way a doctor murmurs a thing she cannot help noticing. She said the sauce on the next table had broken and been brought back wrong, and whoever was on that station was rushing the final mount, and it was a shame, because the foundation under it was good. She said it the way you would note that a singer with a beautiful voice had gone flat on one held note. Carmen looked at her. Daniel looked at her. And a young server, clearing the next table, a slight woman, with her dark hair pulled back hard under a cap, stopped with the plates in her hands and looked at Eunice Garrett for one long second before she carried them away. That server's name was Delphine, and she had worked St. Cloud's line for 2 years before being moved to the floor, and she had heard, in those 2 years, an old chef de cuisine who trained under Devereaux refer exactly once, late at night and half drunk, to the way the boss built his velouté, and call it by a name Delphine had never understood. Until that moment, he had called it Mama Garrett's way. Delphine carried the plates into the kitchen, and she did not throw the words away. Hold that, we are coming back to it. For a while, nothing happened, and that is its own kind of suspense. The family ate. Isaiah grew bored and was given a phone. Carmen tried twice to lift the mood because she could feel the night she had planned slipping, the beautiful evening she had wanted for her grandmother turning into one more room that had looked at her family and decided where they belonged. Eunice felt it too, and she did the thing she had always done, which was to refuse to let a small man set the temperature of her own heart. She talked to Isaiah about his spelling test. She asked Daniel about his work. She held her own table together by hand, the way she had held the kitchen together for nearly 4 decades, and she did not look once toward the window tables she had been kept away from. Gregory Halloran was watching, though. The maitre d' had noticed the old woman set down her fork. He had noticed the murmur and the young server stopping, and he did not like a current in his room that he could not read. So he came across the floor in his charcoal suit, smooth and certain, and he stopped at the bad table by the kitchen door and asked with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth whether everything was to Madame's satisfaction. It was an opening to make peace. Eunice gave him one. She said the meal was lovely and the room was beautiful and her family was happy, and she thanked him. Then, because he had asked, and because 38 years of teaching had made it nearly impossible for her to watch a craft done wrong and stay entirely silent, she added one quiet sentence. She said the velouté going out tonight was breaking on the line, and someone in the kitchen ought to be told before it reached more tables, because a thing made that well should not be allowed to leave the past spoiled. She had handed him a gift. A smart man would have taken it. Gregory Halloran did not take it. His smile thinned. He looked at the small woman in the navy dress at the worst table in his room, the woman he had already filed under a heading in his mind, and he decided that he was being lectured about food by someone who could not possibly know what she was talking about. He said, in a voice pitched just loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, that the velouté at St. Cloud was prepared by Chef Devereaux himself, that it had been called the finest sauce in the country by people who knew, and that he was quite certain Madame had simply never encountered cooking at this level before. The nearest tables heard it. That was the point. A small laugh moved somewhere to the left. Carmen's hand closed hard around her water glass. Daniel started to rise. Eunice touched them both, 2 fingers each, and they stilled, and she looked up at Gregory Halloran with a face as calm and level as still water, and she did not argue. She had never once, in her life, argued with a man who needed to be right more than he needed to be correct. She simply said, "All right," and lowered her eyes back to her hands, and let him win. He walked away, believing he had put an old woman in her place. Here is what he had actually done. He had said the words, quite certain Madame had never encountered cooking at this level, in a room with thin walls between tables, 12 feet from a swinging door, and the young server named Delphine had been standing just inside that door, and she had heard every word. And Delphine had spent the last 20 minutes turning over a name in her head. Mama Garrett, the old chef de cuisine, the one who had trained under Devereaux and left, used to say the boss never gave the woman credit. used to say it like it ate at him. Delphine pushed through the door into the kitchen, into the heat and the steel and the steam, and she walked past the line to the pass where Pascal Devereaux stood plating, and she did something a young server is never supposed to do in the middle of service. She stopped the chef. Now let me bring him back into the light. Because this is his story too, and a man is not only the worst thing the world made of him. Pascal Devereaux, at 41, was lean and tall, with close-cropped hair, gone grey at the temples, and a long burn scar on the inside of his left forearm that he had earned at 19 and never explained to a single interviewer. His face was guarded in the way of men who have decided that softness is a door other people walk through to take things from you. He worked his line with a control that frightened young cooks, and he had built, out of nothing, out of a court paper and a temper, exactly the life he had sworn at 19 he would have. He had also, somewhere in the building of it, made a quiet, total practice of never looking back, because back was the cinder block kitchen, and back was the boy with nothing, and a man on 3 magazine covers cannot afford to remember being that boy. So when Delphine said there was a guest in the dining room saying the velouté was breaking on the line, his first reaction was the reflex of every chef who has ever been told his food was wrong. Cold anger. He asked which guest. Delphine told him. An older woman by the kitchen door, the family Halloran, sat at table 19. And Devereaux almost turned back to his plating, almost let it go as the complaint of a diner who knew nothing. He did not. Because of one thing. Delphine said the words the woman had used. She said the guest had not said the sauce tasted bad. She had said it was breaking on the final mount, that whoever was on the station was rushing it, and that the foundation under it was good, but the emulsion had split and been stirred back wrong. Pascal Devereaux went still at his own pass. No diner talks like that, no critic talks like that. Those were not the words of someone tasting a sauce. Those were the words of someone who had built that sauce 10,000 times by hand, and knew its failure points the way you know the moods of a person you have lived with for years. And underneath the technical words a second thing reached him. Slower, like cold water finding a crack. Breaking on the mount. The foundation is good. He had heard a voice say, almost exactly those words to him before, across a steel table, in a cinder-block room, when he was 19 and furious, and had no idea yet that the woman correcting him was the only person who would ever teach him anything that lasted. He set down his spoon. He asked Delphine to describe the guest again. A small woman, she said. 70, maybe more. Silver hair, short, a navy dress. She had a brooch and an old handbag she kept on her lap, and when the maître d' was rude to her, she did not argue. She just told him Delphine said that a sauce made that well had earned the right to leave the kitchen finished. The sauce deserved better. Pascal Devereaux had not heard that phrase in 22 years. He had heard it first at 19 when he had plated something fast and sloppy to prove he was too good to need the basics, and a small woman with mahogany skin and patient hands had quietly scraped it into the bin and said those exact 3 words to him. Not you deserve better, not I deserve better. The sauce deserved better. It was the whole of her philosophy in 3 words, that the work had a dignity of its own, that you owed it whether or not anyone was watching, and it had taken him years to understand it, and he had built his entire career on the understanding, and he had never once said her name in an interview. He walked off his line in the middle of service. The kitchen froze. A chef does not leave the pass at the height of a Saturday night, and his sous-chef called after him, and he did not answer. He pushed through the swinging door into the dining room, still in his whites, his apron stained, and he stopped. There was a tasting that he could have run instead, and I want you to know he considered it, because it matters that he chose otherwise. He could have had a fresh plate of the velouté carried to table 19 and stood over the old woman while she tasted it and waited to expose her, to prove in front of her family that she could not tell a broken sauce from a perfect one, to defend the dish that had his name on it. That is what the man he had let himself become would have done. He took one step toward the kitchen to order exactly that. Then he looked across his beautiful room, past the window tables glowing amber, past the brass sconces, to the worst table in the house. Jammed against the wall by the door, his cooks ran through, and he saw her, 22 years older. Silver where she had been, black, smaller than he remembered. The way the giants of our childhood always turn out to be. It was the hands that stopped his heart, the way they were folded, still and certain, on top of an old handbag, exactly the way they had folded on a steel table while she waited for a furious boy to finish failing so she could show him again patiently for the 40th time how to do it right. He did not order the tasting. He crossed the room. The dining room watched a celebrated chef walk the length of his own floor with a face nobody at St. Cloud had ever seen on him and stop at table 19 and look down at a small old woman in a navy dress and say one word, low, in a voice that cracked clean in half on the single syllable. He said her name. He said, Mama Garrett. Eunice looked up. For a moment she did not place him, because the last time she had seen Pascal Devereaux he had been 19 and starving and furious, and this was a grey-templed man in chef's whites with a magazine face. Then she saw the burn scar on the inside of his left forearm, the one he had earned in her kitchen, reaching too fast across a hot pan, the one she had dressed herself with a cold cloth in a scalding. She saw the scar, and she saw the boy inside the man, and her whole lined face opened like a window. She said, Pascal, and the most celebrated chef in the city lowered himself onto one knee beside the worst table in his own restaurant in front of 90 people and took her hand and could not speak. That is the moment from the very beginning of this story. This is where we came in. Now you know what the room did not. He knelt because there was no other honest place to put his body. He had spent 20 years standing above everyone, at the pass, on the covers, at the head of the line, and the one person who had given him the foundation he stood on had been seated by his door and laughed at by his own maître d', and a knee was the only true thing left to do. He held her hand and his shoulders shook, and Eunice Garrett, who had buried a husband and outlived half her students and never once let a powerful man see her flinch, put her free hand over his and patted it twice the way she had 1,000 times in a cinder-block room and told him to get up off that floor before he hurt his knee. He got up. He did not let go of her hand. Then, because he was not a man of speeches, and the only language he had ever fully trusted was the work, Pascal Devereaux turned to his frozen dining room and to the maître d' standing white-faced near the podium, and he told them the truth in plain words. He said, the woman at this table taught him to cook. He said everything they had eaten tonight, everything the magazines had praised, the velouté the critics called impossible to copy, he had learned at a steel table from her when he was 19 and had nothing and nobody else would have him. He said her name again so the whole room would have it. Eunice Garrett. He said it the way you set down something you should have been carrying out loud for 20 years. And then he did the thing that mattered more than the speech, because an apology changes nothing if the thing that caused it stays in place. He turned to Gregory Halloran. He did not shout. He had learned restraint from the same woman the maître d' had insulted. He said, quietly, that Mr. Two, Halloran had taken it upon himself to decide who belonged in the front of this room, and that he had seated the finest cook Pascal had ever known beside the kitchen door, and that he had told her to her face that she had never encountered cooking at this level. Pascal said that the trouble with a man who decides who belongs by looking at a dress is that he is wrong precisely when it costs the most, and that St. Cloud could not have a host who threw away the most important guest in the room because she did not look expensive. He said it without heat, which made it final. Halloran's hand went to his lanyard and stopped. There was nowhere for him to put his face. Pascal told him he would finish the evening, and that they would speak in the morning, and everyone in earshot understood that the morning conversation had only one possible end. The consequence did not need to shout. It had already happened in the quiet, the moment the chef chose the old woman over the man who looked the part. That was not the end of the night, though, and the end of the night is the part I most want you to have. Pascal Devereaux did not move his guests to a better table. Think about why. To move them would have been to agree that the table by the kitchen was a lesser place, and that the front of the room was where Worth lived, and he had just spent his whole heart proving the opposite. So instead, he had the kitchen brought to her. He asked Eunice, his hand still not letting go of hers, if she would do him the honor of telling him what had broken in the sauce, not testing her. Asking, the way a student asks, and Eunice Garrett, 71 years old, in her pressed navy dress at the worst table in the house, opened her old handbag and took out the ledger she had bound by hand 50 years before, the brown butcher paper, swollen and grease-spotted, the bay leaf flat in the binding. And she turned to a page she had written when Pascal was still a boy in her kitchen, and she showed him. She walked him through it, the way she had walked him through it at 19. The mount was being rushed. The fat was going in too fast and too warm, and the emulsion was shearing at the edge and getting stirred back together instead of being started again, which a tired cook does at the end of a long night to save 4 minutes, and which costs the whole dish its finish. She told him which station because she had been listening to his kitchen through the swinging door for an hour, and she could hear which burner ran hot. She told him how to fix it in 1 sentence. And Pascal Devereaux, 3 magazine covers, the finest sauce in the country, stood beside her chair and took out his own notebook and wrote down what his teacher said, because the work deserved better, and they both knew it. Delphine watched from beside the kitchen door, the young server who had not thrown the words away, the one who had carried a name across a hot kitchen because something in her refused to let it be lost. She was crying without making any sound, her hand pressed flat over her mouth, and she did not entirely understand why, except that she had spent 2 years in that kitchen feeling invisible, and she had just watched the most powerful person in the building kneel to the most overlooked person in the room. And something she had needed to believe, and almost stopped believing, had turned out, after all, to be true. The plates came out fixed within the hour. Pascal corrected the station himself, and the velouté that left his pass for the rest of that night had the long, clean finish the method was built to give, and not one diner who praised it knew that the correction had come from an old woman's ledger at the table by the door. Eunice would have wanted it that way. She never needed the room to clap. She had told her students for 38 years that the proof of the work is the work. And a sauce served right is the only standing ovation that ever mattered. The family did not leave until late. Isaiah, the great-grandson, had fallen asleep against his mother by the end, the clip-on tie finally still. Carmen, who had come to give her grandmother one beautiful night and had nearly watched it taken away, sat with wet eyes and understood that she had given her something better than she planned. She had not given Eunice a night of being served. She had given her by pure accident the one thing the world had owed her for half a century and never paid, which was to be known out loud in a full room by someone who could no longer pretend not to remember. There is a small thing I have saved for the end, because Eunice did it without any audience, and it tells you who she was. When the meal was finally over and the rumour had thinned, and Pascal walked the family to the door himself, he asked her, almost shy, whether she still had any students, whether the programme still ran. And Eunice told him the cinder-block kitchen had lost its funding 2 years before and closed, and that the steel tables had been sold for scrap, and that this was the part of growing old she minded, not her hip and not her eyes, but the silence where a kitchen full of people who needed a trade used to be. Pascal Devereaux did not let go of her hand. He said, "Then we will open it again." He meant it. By the spring of the following year, there was a teaching kitchen on the east side of the city, new steel tables, ovens that ran even on both sides, named for no one, taking in the same people the world had already counted out. And Eunice Garrett went in 3 mornings a week to teach knife work and patience, and the long way of building a sauce that cannot be rushed and cannot be faked. Pascal funded it and kept his name off the door, because he had learned, finally and completely, that the most important person in a kitchen is almost never the one whose name is on the building. And on the first morning it opened, Eunice took the bay leaf out of the binding of her old ledger, the one she had pressed there at 25 and carried for 50 years, and she set it in a small dish of water on the windowsill of the new kitchen, and she let the new students watch it slowly turn green again at the edges. And she told them a thing her own grandmother had told her, that a person who can cook is never entirely without power, that the skill is yours, that no landlord and no boss and nobody at a brass podium in a beautiful suit can ever throw it away because it does not live in the room. It lives in the hands. So here is the question I will leave with you, and it is a kitchen table question, the only kind worth asking. Somewhere in your own life, there is a person who taught you the foundation you are standing on right now, and the world has probably never once said their name out loud in a full room. You know who they are. The chef found out the hard way in front of everyone on his knees. You do not have to wait that long tonight before this story leaves you. Say their name, even if it is only to yourself, even if it is only a whisper at your own table. The source always deserved better, so do they. So very likely, do you.